Good afternoon and welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center. It's a pleasure to see all of you here. I'm Andrew Seeley. I'm Executive Vice President of the Woodrow Wilson Center, and it's my honor to be able to welcome you here and to say a few words to start off today's discussion. It's initiatives like the topic of today's discussion that exemplify the Wilson Center's mission of producing actionable ideas by providing evidence base for policymaking decisions. We are so pleased to be co-hosting this launch of a new Climate for Peace with the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, our partners on many things, and the State Department, also our partner on many things. Their support has been instrumental to the Wilson Center's leading position in facilitating dialogue on issues of environment, climate, security, and peace building. In particular, I'm glad to see our friends from USAID's Office of Conflict Management and Mitigation here. Good to see you. Their thought leadership and engagement in this area has really helped drive the discussion, and it's through the Resilience for Peace project, our collaboration with the office, that the Environmental Change and Security Program continues to build on more than 20 years of research in this area. And let me recognize also Roger Mark D'Souza, who you will hear from in a minute, but also Jeff DeBelco, who was his predecessor, and both of them have run this project through most of those 20 years, actually. We are pleased to be sharing the stage today with someone who has been a strong partner for many of these years, most recently on this report. Roger Mark, our Director of Population, Environment, Security, and Resilience, will introduce in a second Alexander Carius. But let me just say that we at the Wilson Center are delighted to have had this opportunity to continue our intellectual partnership with Adelphi Research, and we're pleased to welcome Alex back to the Wilson Center. I'd like to now invite Roger Mark D'Souza to the stage to start the program. Roger Mark.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and good afternoon and welcome. So as Andrew has alluded to, we at the Wilson Center have been working with Alexander Carius since the mid-90s on these issues. And as co-founder and managing director of Adelphi Research, Alexander has a rich experience and expertise in the areas of natural resources and governance, climate and energy, and development and security. And Alexander has been applying this expertise to providing guidance on environmental and development issues and looking at overall development policy, and he has been advising government agencies at multiple levels in addition to international organizations. So we're thrilled to have had this long and fruitful collaboration with Alexander and his colleagues at Adelphi Research, together with International Alert and the European Institute for Security Studies on this high-quality analytical report, which is tailored to policymakers to provide them with a thorough understanding of climate fragility interactions and recommendations, looking to concrete actions to address these risks. So Alexander will start us off. He will begin the session by providing an overview of the report, and following his presentation, my longtime friend and colleague and co-author of the report, Jeff DeBelco, will moderate the panel that will illustrate how wide-reaching the importance of this issue is in the U.S. government. Many of you know Jeff DeBelco. He's no stranger to the Wilson Center. He directed our Environmental Change and Security Program for 15 years before my arrival, and he continues his strong ties to the Wilson Center as an ECSP Senior Advisor to the program, in addition to his role as Director of Environmental Studies at Ohio University's Vonovich School of Leadership and Public Affairs. So Jeff will provide short introductions of our distinguished panel following Alexander's presentation. But I will say that we're really pleased to welcome back a number of our colleagues and partners, Alice Hill, Chris Holmes, Melanie Nakawagawa, and Admiral White, to the Wilson Center, and we're very much looking forward to their discussion. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Alexander. Alexander?
Roger Mark, thank you very much for the warm welcome. It's nice to be back here indeed. Almost 20 years that we're working together on looking at the wider security implications of climate change, and I can say this report is not about security implications, even though we touch upon this issue for quite a while. It's a collaborative effort of a group of institutions that have been approached by the G7 foreign ministries a little more than a year and a half ago to ask us on the basis of a mandate that they have designed to look closer into the relationships of climate impacts, dangerous climate change, and how that affects the fragility of states. They also ask us to set up a global information platform that could help foreign policymakers in order to deal with these systemic changes and systemic threats. The first thing that we discussed with them is that we would like to extend the scope of the study a little bit and not exclusively look at those countries that either call themselves fragile or that are labeled fragile, but look into fragility itself. So to what extent parts of society or pockets or situations of fragility occur. This is reflected in the report. You will find the report and the executive summary outside. We started in April last year, April 1st and 2nd, with a planning meeting in Berlin, and asked right on the third day government representatives of the G7 foreign offices to join us. And we told them a little bit how we want to approach the subject and what they could expect from that report. I wouldn't say they weren't satisfied, but at least it took us another 2 meetings, one in Paris and one in Berlin, where we went through the report. So it was quite an interactive, collaborative effort by those who wrote the report and those who in the end received the report. It was handed over to our Foreign Minister Frank-Walter Steinmeier in April this year, just the day before the beginning of the Foreign Ministers Summit in Lübeck, and has been discussed there at the summit, and also some of the recommendations that we put forward have been taken into account. I would like to just go through a couple of things. I can't repeat the 170 pages. This is why you have the full story out there, which tells you about the complexity of issues. It tells you about how climate impacts intertwined with more structural deficits and structural components of both fragility and also conflict. The reason why we looked at fragility is because we were asked to look at the full spectrum of mechanisms in society and governance systems in place by government agencies and states, to what extent they provide the necessary conditions in order to build resilience towards fragility and also to address larger climate risks. As you see from this picture that basically illustrates our approach, we look at global pressures and identify the global pressures. It's not just climate change, even though climate change is an overarching pressure on states and societies, but also the question of population dynamics and population growth, urbanization, pressure on resource availability and resource demand, and to what extent that impacts on what we called systemic risks or compound risks that threaten states and society. I would like to go through these 7 compound risks just quickly. The first one you might be much familiar with, particularly in this room, those who deal with local resource conflict and how resource competition then leads to conflict. We were looking into the larger and long-term changes, but also sudden shocks, and how societies in different rural communities basically deal with this kind of exogenous shocks when it comes to resource distribution and resource use. And what we have learned is that many of already unstable societies where basic conditions that states provide or even local communities provide are affected by sudden shocks or long-term onset change due to climate change, increases instability and even lead to violent conflict, particularly in those regions and areas where dispute resolution mechanisms, both at local level but also at state levels, are not existent. And you find examples of Mali and Sudan, for instance, and a couple of more resource-related, extractive industry-related conflicts that we illustrated in the report. The second one is dealing with livelihood insecurity and the question of migration, even though migration was not meant to be a centerpiece of our report because it cuts across many of the compound risks that we have identified, not as a problem, but as a coping capacity and coping mechanisms of societies. But what we have seen is that climate change will increase and is increasing human insecurity of people who depend on natural resources for their livelihoods, and particularly when they migrate, they often turn into either illegal or unstable, unsecure sources of income. And one of the examples that we used in the report is Syria, where in the north east of Syria, due to a sequence of droughts over a couple of years, I think 5 years, large part of the particularly younger population was pushed into the cities. Cities were not able really to absorb this massive influx of people seeking for jobs, and thus contributing also to a longer cycle that leads then to civil war and conflict. The third one is very much closely linked to what we normally associate with the risks of climate change. So the increase of extreme weather events, both in terms of frequency, but also in terms of depth, and natural disasters. We realized that particularly fragile states that miss basic capacities to address sudden risks and shocks are vulnerable to extreme weather events, particularly when it comes to when they exacerbate the existing safety nets within society and contribute to vulnerability and grievances, especially in conflict-affected situations. Most of these fragile states and fragile societies have experienced already conflict in the past. As you see in this compound risk in the full report, that it is interesting that we both provided the empirical evidence, but also we showed that other countries and other local communities can follow that up. Because it was basically a question, how does the situation look right now, and can we assume if similar crises may occur on the long term, and what kind of countries these are. And in our report, we have illustrated that both emergency responses, for instance, if they are well designed, can either help to overcome existing political conflicts or ethical conflicts, as we demonstrated in the case of the post-tsunami rehabilitation programs in Aceh, but also where ill-designed rehabilitation measures, like at the flooding in Thailand in 2011, can deepen inequality and contribute to social unrest. The fourth risk component is volatile food prices and provisions. We all know that climate change and changing variability and precipitation level can have a significant impact on food production and food insecurity. But when we look at the food security problem, it is not just immediately linked to natural conditions and changing weather conditions, but it's obviously linked to social and economic misconstruction, market dysfunctions, about availability of food at the right time, about the stability of regional food markets, and the readiness of the international aid system in order to provide in situations of crisis sufficient food. So what we have illustrated there is the role of pressure on food prices and price volatility not leading, but at least playing a significant role in the Arab Spring in Egypt in 2011, but also social unrest in other parts of the world. The fifth component is transboundary water management. It's often believed, and if you look at studies also carried out here at the Woodrow Wilson Center Environmental Change and Security Program about the stability of institutions in international water, it's often said that much of the risks in the past have been managed because of stable institutions, political institutions basically river basin commissions that helped to bridge increasing demand and limited resources and distribution. But the problem is that in most international rivers, but even in domestic rivers, where additional pressure is emanating from changing water quality and also river flows, is putting a lot of pressure on existing institutions and legal agreements that are in place. So what we have illustrated there, that both interstate and intrastate conflicts may arise, and we illustrated this with a couple of more well-known international basins, but also some domestic water bodies. The sixth one is sea level rise and coastal degradation. It's often put forward, for instance, in the 2011 Security Council debate on climate risks, that small island states are sinking. Small island governments put forward this argument because it was the first case to say that due to global environmental change, countries are disappearing. It's a legal question when a country is disappearing, but the problem that we have illustrated there is that most of these countries will come under severe pressure already long before they might sink. Because of climatic changes and weather conditions, of destruction of coastal areas, deforestation, etc., even though small island states differ very much in its geography, they suffer already from destruction of coastal areas, saltwater intrusion, lack of availability of income opportunities in coastal areas, etc. And sea level rise on the very long run may also pose significant geopolitical, at least pressures, because sea level rise is resulting in changing sea boundaries, which affect then resource use and the question of extracting natural resources like deep sea mining. And seventh one, last one, is dealing with unintended effects of climate policies. Jeff, you did, but together with us, a report called Backdraft, where we looked that emanated, I think, from a discussion in Copenhagen about the negative effects or side effects well-designed and intentioned climate policy measures can have. And what we witnessed is that we often have good purposes in designing and promoting the exploration and diffusion of renewable energies, but with negative side effects. So the question of biofuels and its effect on food security in the developing world, or an increasing demand about natural resources leading to land grabbing, or the promotion of renewable technologies and the demand for strategic resources and strategic minerals, have negative side effects on the stability of countries and society. So, taking this into account, we looked in the second chapter about across the spectrum of policy areas, and we picked three that we thought are most relevant. One is dealing with climate change adaptation, a second one is dealing with development and humanitarian aid, and a third one with peace building and conflict resolution issues. And we looked at policy initiatives that are in place in different both government institutions and also within the system of international organizations in terms of addressing these very complex systemic risks. And what we have found is that in most cases, both domestically and also internationally, we are a little bit far away from breaking down these sectoral barriers and silos that exist there. And even if we looked at more encompassing policy approaches like addressing climate change and developing, designing, implementing climate adaptation programs in order to build resilience of most vulnerable parts of society or a country, we realize that climate adaptation plans rarely address systematically the question of fragility and conflicts, and particularly when we start applying climate adaptation policies in fragile contexts, and most of the fragile states are considered to be the most vulnerable with regard to climate change impacts, is that we have very little both understanding but also very little tools available that allow us to design adaptation policies in a wise way so that they can pay attention to the very specific conditions of both conflict-affected societies and fragile contexts. We will hear later on, I think, a little bit about what the US government is doing there. I'm not saying that nothing is in place. We have bits and pieces there. We have guidelines, we have guidance notes everywhere. But if you look at the large picture and the large scale, and the kind of evaluation that has been done on climate adaptation programs, there is still a lot of room for improvement. If you are familiar with the humanitarian aid agenda, it has been further developed over the past couple of years in the Hyogo and now the Sendai framework to be more proactive, to forward-looking, in order to build necessary capacities in fragile contexts in order to deal with catastrophes and humanitarian disasters. But what we realize is that if you look at the programs in place, both specific measures or general country policies, they are not really climate proofed. And so climate proofing, even if we started already to develop methodologies, is not yet a standard, particularly in fragile situations. And the problem is that particularly when aid money and humanitarian aid is flowing into a country, most of these fragile societies and countries are not well equipped in order to digest this amount of financial flows coming in. A third sector we looked at is peace building and conflict prevention. Climate change is not yet sufficiently incorporated into fragile or peace and conflict assessments. There are methodologies in place, particularly by aid agencies in doing that. Some of them work well. Both of them in both national and also at the global scale are basically meant to be guidance or help provide guidance and knowledge of how to do things. We don't have, or we have very limited mandatory requirements, particularly in conflict-affected societies and fragile contexts, to apply then a set of measures rigorously. What we suggest to come to the end of what kind of recommendation we provide, you find throughout the report, even in the analytical chapter and particularly in the policy chapter, a lot of very concrete examples that we highlighted that exist already in government institutions or even in non-governmental organizations. But what we ask for is that we don't have a system in place yet that puts resilience at the center of foreign policy. And this is what we actually recommend to develop a new commitment or to commit to resilience and develop a new resilience agenda that addresses the systemic risk in its complexity. And we divided that into 3 different levels of intervention. One is what we are discussing today also here is do your homework. So that is basically what countries can do. Basically integrate climate fragility responses across the spectrum of institutions. We always state that, and we know that our administrations are siloed. We do recognize and increasingly recognize that the interlinkage between climate impact, development, conflict, and fragility are very complex, as we have demonstrated in this report, but we don't have the mechanisms in place and the policies in place. I just attended a meeting a couple of days ago with Achim Steiner on the Sustainable Development Goals, and he recommended really to change the order and not start developing policy programs and measures, but really start working on the political will that is often lacking in order then to put what we recommend into practice. And I think this is where the G7 starts, and what we also recommended in our study, that we need closer cooperation to take existing policy mandates into practice. In the Council conclusions of the Lübeck Foreign Ministers Summit, the foreign ministers agreed to set up a task force. We said high level, they said a working group. No, it's a task force of leading executives in the different foreign offices to get together to critically review the recommendations of this report and to come up with their own conclusions by the end of the year and report back to the G7. We are very satisfied with that. Some here in the room helped us to get this on the agenda of the foreign ministers. And as you might be familiar, no matter how you look at the G7 summit in Elmau outcome, at least there was a very strong statement introducing decarbonization in the language of diplomats. So I think the ambition is clear. We know where we go, but I think it requires a lot of, well, coordination, but also bringing the existing knowledge in different institutions across the spectrum of foreign policy, from environment, climate, development, peace building, agriculture, to foreign policy and security policy into the picture. And as I said in the beginning, we were asked not only to write the report, but also to develop an information platform, a global information platform for foreign policymakers and those who work on global policies and politics, which is, as you see in the report, called newclimateforpeace.org, that today in the afternoon, I'm glad that my colleagues managed to do that, put up the information platform that provides more information both on what we have analyzed there, so the empirical evidence that policymakers would need, but also would enable you to engage in a discourse, because we have the so-called resilience block that is ongoing there, and a database which is called Factbook, a fact book on climate and fragility that allows you, even as a non-expert on a subject, to download 2 pages and 4 pages on a given complex that introduces you the problem, but also solutions to the existing problems. The third one, to keep it short, is act together and break down sectoral barriers and siloed approaches, basically to integrate considerations of climate, peace building, humanitarian aid into a larger perspective of what we design and outlined as the resilience agenda. And the fourth one is building partnerships both at the global level, but also with the necessary stakeholders to build and, to develop resilient environments at the local level. This was introduced because we do not pretend that it is just the question of organizing dialogue among foreign policymakers. It is also lobbying at the global level for UN organizations in order to break the silos that exist. If you look at UNDP's budget for this year, it's 2/3 of its budget is going to 4 countries alone. So you could imagine with the other 140 countries that experience severe poverty and situations of fragility suffer, and what kind of conditions and capacities we have to create and build. That's it for the moment. A snapshot of our report. Thank you.
Good to see you. I know.
Alex, I'll just tell you ahead of time, I'm pulling this up here for the Q&A so you can join us when the time comes. Very good. Well, thank you very much, Alex, and thanks to so many people who are here in the room who were instrumental and invaluable all along the process from the very beginning and throughout in sharing their insights, sharing their time, sharing their advice in producing this report and then sharing it. It has been many hands have come to the table, and we really appreciate that very much. We have this opportunity now to talk about what the U.S. government's doing, and we obviously have leading people with portfolios that are focused on these issues. Talk about what we're doing now, how we're doing that, and then also some of the opportunities as we hear and learn more about the compound risks that we heard about and some of the recommendations, how we are envisioning ways forward in tackling those realities and those complexities. It's often so understandable that we want to reduce that complexity, keep it simple, keep our portfolios narrow. But these folks are representative of those who understand and see the need to work across these stovepipes and these topics and these briefs. And so we're excited to hear them reflect and have you join in a conversation to talk about ways forward, building on the understandings that come out of that. As Roger Mark said, I'll keep the introduction short so that we have more time with them, although they're very distinguished people. In the order that I have them anyway. It doesn't necessarily correspond with them up here. But Melanie Nakagawa is a member of the Secretary of State's policy planning staff, and her portfolio focuses on energy, environment, climate change. Previously, she worked with the senator and the chairman, Senator Kerry, on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, where she was focused on these issues. And it's terrific to welcome her back to the center as long-time opportunities to work with her on these issues. Alice Hill joined the White House National Security Council staff in September 2013 as the Senior Advisor for Preparedness and Resilience, and now serves as Senior Director for Resilience Policy at the NSC. We here at the Wilson Center had a chance to work with her when she was Senior Counselor to the Secretary of Department of Homeland Security, where they were really grappling through these issues and what it meant for a very complex portfolio and department. And so her leadership there was absolutely instrumental in leading their efforts to have climate adaptation plans throughout that department. So it's terrific to have her back to the center again. Rear Admiral Jonathan White is the oceanographer and the navigator of the Navy, Director of Space and Maritime Domain Awareness. He's worked in the field of oceanography for a number of decades, a wide variety of deployments and commands, including head of the Task Force Climate Change and the Navy Deputy to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And someone like so many of these people who was there at the beginning when this whole report and the idea for it were being discussed. And finally, another person that it's wonderful to welcome back to the stage here at the Wilson Center, Chris Holmes, who's the Deputy Assistant Administrator at USAID's Bureau of Economic Growth, Education, and Environment. The agency's first global water coordinator, has been critical in formulating and spearheading and implementing AID's global water strategy, and has worked across these issues for many, many decades and has been generous in sharing those insights here on this stage over the years. So we're going to just have a kind of conversation, and then we'll open that up and go and bring in the significant expertise that's here in the room. But maybe in the order there that I introduced you, is to start, Melanie, from your perspective, kind of reflecting on this report, and again, thank you for your insights kind of throughout this process, but whether it's within the State Department in the quadrennial diplomacy development review, whether it's the negotiation that many, in fact, folks here in the audience are still tired, and the climate negotiations. I know Andrew's getting some sleep now after a couple weeks in Bonn and no sleep. The diplomats of the State Department in Paris, the SDGs that Alex mentioned. How do you see these connecting, and then particularly with the department's heavy focus on resilience, connecting to the things that you have underway already?
Great. Well, thank you, and thanks again for inviting me here today. It's a great forum, and it's a great venue to come here to speak at this issue. So I'm glad you're doing this. As you mentioned, before joining State, I was with the Foreign Relations Committee, where we really worked hard to advance a climate change legislation. And actually, security was the frame that then Chairman Kerry at the time really focused on, was the national security implications of climate change. And so it's actually with sort of based on his personal interest and with his passion for the subject, we're actually continuing that frame at the department since coming over there in 2013. And in my current position in the Policy Planning Office, we're really focused on emerging threats, sort of future threats, strategic foresight issues. And one of those areas is confronting how we address climate change as a foreign policy priority and how that fits within the national security frame. It's the first time someone in the policy planning shop is really looking at the nexus across the silos that were mentioned earlier, from food, energy, water, climate change, all those pieces, sustainable development, are all within sort of this portfolio that I'm focused on currently, and seeing how you bring the silos within department together in a much more cohesive fashion. So it should come as no surprise that, one, we really welcome this report. The idea that you're identifying policy gaps as well as recommendations for ways forward is really something that is quite keen to my office in particular. In addition, though, it should come as no surprise that the Secretary of State is really excited about how we can advance climate security and climate change more broadly. At the department, really focused on, one of our key missions is how do you advance freedom for the benefit of the American people as well as the international community by focusing on a sustained, democratic, secure, and a prosperous world. And this one is one that's composed of well-governed states. So the idea of fragile states is one that we're particularly keen to address. And the fact that climate change is already exacerbating and complicating our very mission in many ways. So with that, let me just give you a couple examples of how this actually addresses the compound risks you identified, but also some of these key areas that are really complicating our own mission at the department. And one is on humanitarian assistance. The U.S. is the largest contributor by volume of humanitarian assistance responding to large-scale natural disasters and violent conflicts. In the realm of natural disasters, we know what science is telling us, and that is the intensity and severity of storms and droughts are increasing and in many parts of the world. And this is resulting in greater and more extensive damages in particular, and those in particularly vulnerable regions and communities. So we know that these impacts are happening and that they're destabilizing some areas, and that's obviously a key area for our foreign policy. Another compounding area that I was particularly keen to look at was the security aspect. And Chris actually is the key expert here on water, so I won't go into the water aspects in particular, but whether it's water security or food security, the connection between those and climate is evident. And the areas of the world that project to become more food insecure or more water insecure are also key areas where we're focused on from a foreign policy perspective. In the food security office, because we don't actually have that represented here, our office, the Special Representative of Food Security, is actually working through Feed the Future, the U.S. government's global hunger and food security program, as well as the Global Climate Change Initiative, to look at how you help communities such as pastoralists or smallholder farmers develop tools and techniques to help them address climate-related challenges, such as availability of water or food for crops and livestock. In the area of diplomacy, another key area where we mentioned the political will needed first before you actually move into the next areas, this is an area where, on diplomacy, water cycles is one of the key areas that we're seeing a lot of these impacts. And in addition to the water piece of it, we're also looking at areas like the Arctic. So you're looking at not only coastal erosion, but also the changes in glacial cover and ice pack and ice flows. And on the Arctic issue, I'm happy to talk about that the U.S. recently took over the Arctic Council chairmanship earlier this year. And we've got a 2-year chairmanship of the Arctic Council where climate change is actually one of our key pillars to the chairmanship. That really reflects the idea of diplomacy being a key pillar to addressing these issues. The other key piece, just to go to the other aspects you talked about, was on economics. And this is one where, in terms of fragility and security, economics is in our favor, right? Clean energy and how you move the markets to address these threats is a key part of the solution, and we're doing a lot to that end. So as you mentioned, the department is full of some of our smartest diplomats, and we're deploying them as we speak to address this issue. And part of the tools we're providing them on the integration front is twofold. One is, as you mentioned, these policy guidance documents. We have a policy guidance document. The first policy guidance out of Secretary Kerry was a guidance document on climate change. And this document really talked about how the diplomats, our ambassadors, deputy chief of missions, and even assistant secretaries can all elevate climate change as a foreign policy priority. And in this policy guidance document, we outlined several areas for our engagement, but one area in particular was actually the security nexus. How can we be addressing the security nexus in a much more cohesive fashion? And this came out about 2 years ago. So we're not ahead of the curve, but we definitely put that out on day one to let the department know where we were going to see this issue. The second document is what you mentioned, the Quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review. And the QDDR, the 2015 version of the QDDR, there's been one previous edition before that, really builds on the 2015 National Security Strategy that identifies climate change as a threat to our national security. And in building on that, the 2015 QDDR recommends probably 5 key areas in the climate space that are relevant. One is how to deploy greater expertise in addressing climate change and promoting clean energy solutions. The second one is strengthening staff understandings of how do you actually engage on climate as part of our core competencies as a diplomat, both within state and AID. The third area is integrating climate change into all of our diplomacy and development efforts at large, whether that's strategic planning or programming as well. The fourth area is identifying critical countries to intensify our in-depth climate engagement. The last area is expanding our clean energy and climate diplomacy beyond capitals. This is going to the local area. So one of the core areas that you identify in the report was this idea of local impacts. And this is another area where we're really trying to figure out how does the department better engage at the local authority level to talk about climate resilience. Lastly, on the resiliency piece and how we integrate and mainstream resiliency, Alice will talk more about the executive order, but that's a key conduit for how we're really ramping up the discussion internally on how do we promote resiliency, both from an infrastructure perspective, just our embassies and posts abroad, from just a basic sort of logistics perspective, but then also into our strategic programming, whether it's country programmings or regional programming, which we do on a regular basis. And how do you include resiliency and fragility into that discussion? So just a couple key areas to get the conversation started off this afternoon.
Oh, that's terrific. And your mention of the executive order is a great lead-in to ask Alice to talk about that on the executive order on resilience. And as a leader on the implementation of that, the President's Climate Action Plan, you have, by definition, working across all these different departments. And so understanding your successes and challenges and lessons learned from this effort to integrate across would be terrific to hear your reflections on.
Sure. I think that perhaps I'm a case study of what happens in the federal government when we start on a tough problem. You'll recall that the President issued his first executive order in this area in 2009. It required essentially all federal agencies to engage in sustainability planning and adaptation planning. I was very new to DHS. This order came in. I'm a former judge. Didn't know a lot about climate change, and it became my responsibility. So at DHS, and with the help of Admiral White, we turned very seriously to the question, should an agency like DHS even care about climate change? Now, in 2009, that was a serious question. We did not have a definitive consensus view within the department. So we had the hard work of answering that question and looking at each of our mission spaces to determine that we in fact should care deeply. I think you've seen a similar evolution in the national documents reflecting on this. 2010, there's a national security strategy, makes a very strong statement about climate change. And then you see the QDR, the QHSR talking about climate change as a threat multiplier, and then you see a 2015 national security strategy pulling this out as one of the key threats to the United States, and then you get a report like this saying we really need to integrate this into all of our considerations. So there are challenges in bringing everyone along to understand the threat, because that's really where we have to start. Everyone has to recognize that there's a threat, and this is something we need to do things about. I have been working on the second portion of this, as Jeff has mentioned. What do you do about it? How do you start really making choices that will make a difference to better prepare a nation, a fragile state, or even the United States to the impacts of climate change? And much of our focus has historically been on the mitigation, and there's less developed activity in the adaptation space. So this is new territory for many people across the federal government. And we've done a number of things with through the President's executive orders, President very forward-leaning on this, to take action within the United States. But two things have really been seminal in the international area, and they also grew out of the President's executive orders. After that first executive order, he issued in November 2013 an executive order creating a Council for Climate Preparedness and Resilience. And really, the design of that council was to take all of the mission-based Department of Energy, Department of Commerce, Department of Defense, DHS, all of them with their separate missions, and say, what do we need to do to build resilience to climate change? And that council has been meeting regularly. In one of the very first meetings, the international agencies said, we don't see ourselves enough in this, and we want to be a part of it, and we want to get working on how we can build resilience internationally. And that's how the executive order came about. The President signed last September an executive order that requires all of U.S. development work to be screened for climate resilience risks by, and we've called out this date for ourselves, October 1st of this year. So new projects will be screened across the federal government. And why is this so important? Well, if we're going to invest taxpayer dollars to help other countries, we need to make sure that those taxpayer dollars can withstand the impacts that are projected. And if we look at the historical impacts, of course, we will not be adequately prepared. If we just look at historical data on climate, as civil engineers will tell you and others, we need to have the projections. But when you get down to actually doing this, there are still major challenges. We don't have downscale data routinely available. That's true for the United States, and that's certainly true across the world. So when you get to a city trying to plan, or a nation state trying to plan how high do they need to build that new port, or what kind of steps do they need to take to protect that road, they may not have the necessary data, and it may be a pretty broad cut. That could be okay. I think Admiral White can tell you that there are comfort levels here. But we don't have that downscale data routinely available. The second thing is we don't have translators. We don't have the people who are experts in the impacts of climate change, what that means for how you build, where you build, what that means for fragile states. We simply don't have that cadre built yet of knowledgeable people who can consult and offer the advice. So when we screen for climate resilience anywhere, do we have the cadre of people to say, well, that means you need to do X if you have that risk? And we're still building that now. So the implementation portion of these will remain challenges, but I can tell you we're hard at work. A second area that we've done in the international is a public-private partnership with 8 partners. We just announced this several weeks ago. The American Red Cross, Asian Development Bank, ESRI, Google, Inter-American Development Bank, the Skoll Global Threats Fund, and the UK government and the United States government. And this is designed to provide climate services to developing nations so that they can better prepare and be more resilient to the impacts of climate change. That's taking all of the resources from those organizations and bringing them down so that a nation can pick projects, get the downscale data, get the necessary expertise to make the choices, and then move forward. And we have chosen 3 countries, Colombia, Ethiopia, and Bangladesh as our first pilot projects, because we really need to learn how you do this. I don't think that there is consensus yet that anyone knows how to do it well. That's a wonderful thing in some ways, because no one can tell you, oh, we already tried that and it doesn't work. On the other hand, we're really at the front end of this, of trying to determine how we should move forward. We are making similar choices and efforts on the domestic side, and it is challenging to figure out what makes economic sense as we make continuing investments. And one place that we have chosen, and I think that we are continuing to focus on, is our infrastructure. Because as we make long-term investments on things that will be with us for 50 to 100 years, we need to make sure that those investments will last through the projected impacts. But I want to applaud this report because I think it brings together and synthesizes many of the challenges that we've seen. And it really reflects that if we don't think through how we are helping countries through the climate lens, think through their fragility risks posed by climate change and by independent factors, we really are at risk for not being able to achieve our goals, because that threat multiplier of climate change could knock aside all the important work, or much of the important work that we're doing in this space. So I just want to applaud the leadership of the G7, as well as those who have been doing this report, because it certainly rang true to me in what we are experiencing here from the White House and formerly from the DHS perspective. So thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Alice. It's terrific to hear that that evolution, and then the kind of things even just within the last week, these major initiatives to grapple with exactly the problems we're identifying. Admiral White, could you reflect then from your perspective, and obviously as the oceanographer, but with working within a department and a sector that has tackled these issues in multiple ways, but how do you come to the report and the activities that DoD is doing and doing increasingly in partnership with the other folks here around the table?
Okay, well, thanks. First of all, I'd like to say, when you introduced me, you thought you were going to say I'd been there from the start of climate change.
No.
Old, Jeff, but I know I was there in July over in the UK when we commissioned reports. I felt much better in July 2013. First of all, I'm going to talk about, a lot of talk about some of the great work going on. I figured I was just going to change the course and talk about three things. I was going to talk about sports cars, starfish, and football, or soccer for those of us who think that a football is a prolate spheroid instead of a truly spherical object. Sports cars. So about 3 months ago, I was in Bulgaria at the kickoff of a NATO crisis response center dealing with flooding and climate-related impacts in the Balkans largely. Very interesting. We were trying to look at how you talk about resilience and climate change and how do you measure it. And I sort of came up with this idea that I call the resilience tachometer, which is basically you've got climate change, which is the acceleration. There's somebody pushing on the gas pedal and the needle's going however fast it may be. And then you've got somewhere over here this red line on your dashboard. And you know that if the needle gets in the red line, things blow up. You have a fragile nation, you can have conflict. And those are the things we're trying to keep from happening. So as I look at increasing the resilience and keeping things from blowing up, conflict or otherwise, we're trying to really move that red line well away from where the max RPMs are. And so when I look at that model, I think of the things that, how do we do that? How do we increase the resilience? And realizing that each individual nation, each individual region, each thing that we're looking at, each has a different tachometer. And so we need to understand exactly where that red line is and also where the needle is going in terms of the effects that we're looking at, whether it's sea level rise, it's catastrophic weather events. And if we can sort of create that measuring device, it's a simple way for me to say, okay, and then here's the things that we can do to modify that red line and increase the resilience. Some of the things that we need. We've got a young lady here, Chris Crozier from the National Geospatial Agency that I just met last week. They want to get, according to the director of NGA that does geospatial intelligence for the entire world, that can tell you what humans are doing on coastlines at almost a level that I can see you in this room in some places. But they're interested in getting involved in the climate change work, looking at human activity, looking at coastal changes, looking at what's going on with moisture content and water quality and these kinds of issues. So what they really do is this thing called anticipatory analytics, which is not, like you said, Judge Hill, is not just looking at what's happened before. How do we anticipate the future based on the activity and changes that we're seeing? So bringing them in to help define where that red line is for individual folks. Looking at a lot of other sources of intelligence and information about populations and these type of efforts are critically important to determining where that red line is. So that's my tachometer. Starfish. So we can sit there and try to determine exactly what each red line is and what the gauge is, but we need to start taking action, and that's why I really salute this report, and it says taking action. I and DoD have been saying we've got to start doing things, and I'm reminded of the kid on the beach that sees a whole bunch of starfish at low tide washed up and starts throwing starfish back into the water. And a man comes up and says, "Why are you throwing? You can't throw them all back. You're wasting your time." And the kid sticks it up, throws this one back and says, "Well, I just saved that one." If we look at an individual nation, okay, we've got all these starfish, and I want to take action. What could happen? I could throw one starfish back. That starfish could go back. It could become the food source for a stone crab. The stone crab could survive by eating that one starfish before it was starving, lay 500,000 eggs. 100,000 eggs actually grow up to be big crabs. They feed a nation. That nation then, therefore, is actually secure with respect to food, and they don't go take food from their neighbor. So we reduce conflict. See? Starfish to food security. But the real truth is, how do we find out which starfish? Because another thing is we want to pick the starfish that's going to actually walk back to the reef and get eaten by the crab. not the one that's just going to crawl up on the beach and die again. This is the willingness that USAID does a great job in talking about who's willing to participate. So as we look at taking action, we want to make sure we're taking action that is smart, and that's where understanding the geopolitics comes in. And so that partnership to getting after that is critically important, but we can't wait for perfect science. We try to look at it as risk-based, the resilience of the red line, what's the risk, and then based on sometimes just some guesses, this is where we want to go. So we know nations like Bangladesh really want to participate and understand what is going on and work with us to try to make that nation more resilient. Oh, and then there's the football or soccer piece. That is the piece where when we started this 2 years ago, I felt like a lot of well-meaning kids out on the field playing little kid soccer over there at Wilton Hall. But I think now we've maybe moved on to, we're sort of maybe in elementary school soccer, maybe toward middle school. We're not quite all wandering over the field saying, yeah, I want to do something about climate change and resilience. We're starting to really work together. But we've got to get to World Cup, and that means making the right decisions, using the right information, and working together to solve that problem and going after the right starfish. We in DoD are very interested in doing that. We want to be a partner, and we certainly are excited about the plan that is called out here. And we look forward to being part of that team, not just from here in D.C., but we need to push this out toward our regional commanders, our regional activities, and work across the stovepipes of federal agencies, international agencies, and embassies to create the plan to start taking care of the right starfish at the right time. So that's basically what I've got to say, and I'm going to wander off the stage to grab my jacket real quickly because you are right, it's freezing cold up on this stage, and before I get chilled up. So thank you very much, Jeff.
Sure thing. Thank you very much, Admiral. This would be the only place in Washington today that's actually cold. Chris, let's turn to you. You've been working on these issues in the field in all sorts of settings, and on the one hand have a kind of very specific focus on water, but almost by definition then you're hitting all sorts of these different areas because water is so integral to health, to economics, to anti-poverty, and to issues of foreign and security policy. So in that sense, can you reflect on how you and your portfolio are tackling it, but also because you're so integrated into the wider aid discussions and development across government, how you see these compound risks and the focus of the report connecting to your experience and lessons learned?
I'd be glad to. The problem is they've already answered all the questions.
Oh, no.
The problem with being the wrap-up person, right, is that you sit and you scramble the whole time going, well, not this thing. This is how we'll keep trying. All the good metaphor is gone. So let me just start a little bit with just one quick story on my introduction to climate change and silos. So in 1976, I was directing in the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, and we were working in the Sahel, and I was summoned by Senator Kennedy. And he had a little teeny office outside of the big office, and I could tell he was not happy, and I'd never met him. And he said, you know, what I can't get is you people from aid keep coming up here, and you can never get out in front of these droughts. Why can't you predict a drought? And I said, well, you know, I can't really answer that question right now, but I'll try. So I went back down and I talked to my friends at aid, and I said, well, who predicts the weather? And one person said, well, why don't you try the Weather Service? It was a pretty logical conclusion. So I walked over to NOAA and I said, I've got this problem, and do you do any projections? And they said, we do. We do them on wheat yield. And they were doing analyses around the world, and a very primitive system compared to what we do now, to put it mildly. But I said, well, could you basically switch those analyses or at least build off of them for the Sahel? And they said they would. And that led to the Famine Early Warning Systems Network, which is the backbone of what we do now. Now that was that was the first step. I mean, there were many, many sophisticated things that occurred from there. But it was a great lesson about kind of reaching out to other sources of knowledge in the government and finding great discoveries, and I want to return to that. So staying with water, but talking a little bit about how we get to the World Cup, let me provide some of these thoughts. When we read this excellent report, which I really enjoyed, and I did read all of it, there were some things that really I extracted from it that I think really bears on how we're going to really be responding increasingly as we go into the future as it relates to climate change and water. And I see, in many ways, the water as essentially, in some ways, being the transformer or the nexus, or whatever you want to call it, between climate change here and fragile risks over here. And how you manage your water programs in between has a huge amount to deal with how you mitigate the prospect for increased fragility. And in that regards, when we look at our programs at aid, what we take away from the report is that clearly the report encourages us and anybody else in this business to be much more anticipatory and adaptive as we look out into the future. And definitely what comes home to us in the water field is that when the report talks about these increased demands for food, water, and energy over time, what becomes pretty clear is water becomes almost the denominator to how you're going to handle that. Because obviously it handles water, but to meet our food needs, we have to be pretty imaginative in water management, and clearly the same thing with energy. And I felt that the 5 or the 7 really kind of dangerous trends, the risks that we talked about today, one way or another, they all relate to water. So it makes you think a little bit about the future programs. And what's so exciting about the field we're in right now is that, as was said earlier, we are at a very young stage in trying to really figure out how to tackle this problem of climate change and fragility in that nexus. But in being at that stage, many of the considerations that were in the report, over time are going to be integrated into our water programs right now. Right now, our water programs are pretty basic. They deal fundamentally with water supply, sanitation, and hygiene, and some nexuses as they relate to water supply, sanitation, and hygiene with education, with nutrition, with HIV/AIDS, and food production. But, as the world faces more and more dire challenges, the water programs are going to have to adjust and become much more linked into that whole array of risks that we talked about today. I do think that in the water area, what really stood out in many ways for me, and Judge Hill was talking about this just now, was really this focus on data and the absence of data and getting your hands on data. It is really critical. And it always amazes me that it's not there, but on the other hand, it amazes me when you find out a lot of it is there, but you just didn't know it. And so how do you bring it into your world? So at aid to solve problems in the water sector, or really in other sectors, we're making a very significant investment in the collection of data. And particularly through the Famine Early Warning Systems Network, and a recent decision to integrate into that network the GRACE system that many of you know about and that was alluded to in the report. And the GRACE system most recently has become well known because it's a system that's being used in California to essentially monitor shifts in the status of critical aquifers in the major parts of the California northern and central valleys. We've also making a major investment in systems that enable us to better understand glacial melt and snowpack melt and the status, compounds of water in the high Himalayas as it affects 12 countries. We're making a major investment in working with countries through NASA's SEVERE system in enabling countries to basically take all this data and do something productive with it. So this connection between the need for data and being able to convert that data into water-related programs becomes pretty key. Kind of a word about integration. There's a lot said about integration, and people, they get very happy about integration. Everybody wants to integrate, but it's really hard. It does not happen overnight. It's really tough, and it's really the fundamental kind of foundation of program development and where we're going. But so little is known about integrative approaches in climate change. And one of the reasons I'm so happy to have returned to AID is that there are so many creative people there. So the team at AID that does conflict management and mitigation, and Cynthia Brady is here from that team today, they have been really leaders at basically saying, before we fall in love with all the rhetoric, let's get the research and let's get some of the data down. And Cynthia and Jeff are working together here at the Wilson Center on doing some of the really early seminal research as it related to these questions. And over time, it matured, and they've come up with more documentation that we can really start using in the development of programs as it relates to integrative approaches. And this is one of my favorites. This is the Climate Change and Conflict Annex, which is to the Aid Climate Resilient Development Framework. And it's really worth reading. It's just a fine piece of work, and it's quite disciplined. And I guess the next point that kind of stood out for me is systems. This is a very complex system that we're all dealing with. In fact, it's the system. And kind of understanding the linchpins in the system is what's really key. And understanding the ripple effects in the system, because the system isn't static. A system is dynamic. And so really understanding how that system operates and adjusts. But then again, what are the linchpins where if something goes wrong with certain points in the system runs the risk of either partial or total collapse. And I think that water is a really critical point in that system. It's almost like a fulcrum for so many other elements, and it has to be understood that way. But to really understand it, people who are looking at the system have to be committed to operate on a systems basis. In other words, you can't have a system response unless you have a system development, a group of developers. So how people come together, in our case in the federal government, and developing the systems responses becomes absolutely critical. And how do you do that when we're such a tribal species, is really tough to do that. And I think that as we build this curriculum and this base of knowledge as we go forward into the future, I expect that there are going to be more and more leaders who really demand systems thinking and systems behavior and tremendous precision and tremendous possession of knowledge as you embrace this. So these are kind of some of the really key points that we see as the report affects us. And I would like to say just one concluding thing about water is that sometimes it's the obvious that's so easy to miss, And I think that the obvious on water as it relates to economic development is essentially the question of sustainable water supply, You got to have data to better understand it, but there's ways to get a fix on the sustainability of water supply. In some cases, we don't need a bevy of satellites to help you figure that out. And I think what we're finding out, and I think what I feel in my field of water management, is it won't be too long before we stop for a moment before we embark on the development of any development project, and we ask just one fundamental question. And that question is, do we have enough water? Can we manage the water effectively to sustain this activity? And it will be development activity by development activity, education projects. I think the day will come, we won't even do an education project today without asking the one fundamental question: is there enough water to enable young women in these schools to have water and sanitation, for that matter, in order to meet fundamental hygiene needs so they stay in the school and they don't leave? And that seems to be obvious, but it really isn't obvious. And that question, which seems to be obvious, but really isn't obvious, is going to apply to every single point along the development spectrum. That's where I think this is all going. And it's being driven really heavily by climate change. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. So, yeah, indeed. I've got lots of scribbles, and I'm very tempted to ask a number of follow-up questions, but I'm also mindful that we want to have this be a larger conversation. And so if there are opportunities for all of you to talk about kind of how you see the ways that we get past the integration conundrum that Chris has said, which is, kind of like the weather, right? Everybody talks about it, but nobody does anything about it, right? I don't think we're that pessimistic, right? We have some ways forward, but so looking for opportunities to talk about our ways forward on integration and the systems thinking that Chris has highlighted, but all of you have highlighted. Why don't we open it now to the floor for some questions, and we can continue this discussion. We have a couple colleagues who have microphones. We ask that you wait till those are brought to you so the folks who are watching online can hear the questions. We'd love for you to tell us who you are and pose a quick question, and then we'll perhaps gather a few and then give our panelists an opportunity to divide and conquer in responding to them. So who would like to kick off our discussions? Yes, and Alex, if you could join us up here so you can participate in the discussion as well. Yes, so if we could start over here.
Ken Dillon, Ciencia Press. Geoengineering. What is the U.S. Policy stance on geoengineering, and in particular initiatives, projects by foreign countries? What do we do? What do we plan to do if they have a geoengineering project?
Terrific, thank you. And certainly for those of you, I know because you're all going to go home and read every page of this report, you will find discussions in that seventh, I think, compound risk of the ways that folks may be responding to this that climate change challenge that has lots of externalities. Okay, so geoengineering question. David Mickle down here in the front.
David Mickle with the Stimson Center here in Washington. I would just like to pick up on that last comment about the difficulty of integration. Integration is hard. Who can be in favor of ad hoc policy making? We'd all like to be integrated. But if it's so hard for the United States with the resources that we have and where we throw around the term of art whole of governance approach, how difficult is it for our partners in Bangladesh, Colombia, for them to also undertake integrated policy approaches? How integrated do they need to be in order for us to best cooperate with them, and how can we facilitate, cultivate, enhance their integration, given just how hard it is?
Okay, terrific. Yeah, we could have a debate as to whether more resources makes it harder or easier to play nice with one another, but that's an essential question. We take one more here in the middle, or a couple, and then we'll give a, so if we could, the microphone's going to come to you there. We'll get the two of you, and then.
Hi, Jean Boucher from George Mason University. I haven't read the whole report. It seems very adaptation heavy, resilience heavy, disaster recovery heavy. I'm just wondering, have we siloed off from mitigation? So I feel like I'm asking a question I'm not supposed to be asking, but should we be looking at taking our foot off the gas pedal? Currently, I hear that 90% of the heating, we've created an oven around the Earth, and 90% of the heating is being sucked up by the deep oceans. And so we're not really seeing the real effects of what's going to, the oceans are going to bounce back at some point. So if we're just adapting, we're going to have to keep adapting until we get our feet off the gas pedal. So I'm just wondering.
Terrific. No, absolutely. All questions are just fine. The adaptation mitigation balance is one that we've had for a long time. Yep.
David Erdue with MIT Lincoln Laboratory. Several of you mentioned needs for new tools and technologies, whether it was the ability to downscale in our mapping and projections, tools for taking climate models and turning them into better infrastructure planning, and that is relevant to all kinds of agencies, DOD, DHS, and certainly abroad. But my question is, who would have ownership of those tools? Who has the responsibility for developing them, since there are so many different parts of the government for whom it would be relevant?
Okay, well, there we have four. We have the engineering, the challenges of integration here and with partners, mitigation versus adaptation balance, or I won't say versus, and mitigation and adaptation, and then the tools and where do they reside and develop and go forward. Anyone want to pick up on a piece of that? Alice,
I'd like to answer the tools, the last question, because it's something that's part of the President's Climate Action Plan. The President issued his Climate Action Plan almost exactly 2 years ago, and one of the call-outs in that is greater data. So there have been two efforts. There's a data initiative to take really massive amounts of data that the federal government accumulates and make it available, with the hope that the private sector, other individuals will use that, develop new tools from it. And that continues, that is run through the U.S. Global Change Research Program with a number of the science agencies, as well as the Office of Science and Technology and Policy. Similarly, that same group is running another initiative, which is about creating tools for users, anyone from somebody interested, homeowner, or somebody just in a community, to a planner for a city or a region. So the federal government has developed a large set of tools, and what that effort is to take those pre-existing tools organize them and make them accessible in a fashion to a whole range of stakeholders, so that people can begin making the important choices. This data issue is probably the single thing that has been asked for most by those that we have interacted with through the President's Climate Action Plan. He created a task force consisting of state, local, tribal leaders, and this was one of their major requests. What do we plan for? We know it continues to be a challenge. You can see that if you go out to any community. Some communities, New York City, California, have sophisticated tools of their own. If you go to CalAdapt, for example, you can zero down and see what the sea level rise is going to look like along the coast of California. But we don't have that everywhere. And all of those communities are making land use decisions as they're making them worldwide. They need to know what the sea level rise risk. We don't have the great tools yet for extreme precipitation. When 7 inches of rain falls in a couple hours, where's that water going to go? What do we need to do for evacuation routes? And also, what's that going to do to our infrastructure and existing communities? We're still working on that modeling, and NGA has been a leader in this. They just had a seminar or conference in Boulder, Colorado, to bring together modelers from across the federal government and outside to start tackling with how are we going to build human security using these data sets. Huge effort undergoing, but it's still, we're still learning what resonates and what will really help in addressing preparedness.
Melanie?
I'll just pick up on where Judge Hill left off on the tools piece, because from the international perspective, it's this really interesting question of how, once we have these tools, and there already exist many of these tools in the sort of both of the president's platform as well as elsewhere within the U.S. government. But then from the department, how do you turn that tool into a diplomatic tool? So how do you convert the policy and the analytics into actually diplomacy? And that's one where the department's really interested in talking more about that. So there's two questions. To one of your questions, you asked about the existing tools, but there's also, I would also challenge you to think about other tools that are really useful that are yet to be created or that are necessary. And that's one where we're talking about the predictive capabilities. And how do you really think about some of these predictive capabilities? And you mentioned actually the anticipatory analytics, but that plus predictive capabilities, even from a modeling perspective, what do those look like? And then how do we actually get a hold of those and turn it into a diplomatic tool? So not asking for us to own those tools per se, but how do we actually use them and incorporate them within the department's diplomacy outreach? And this thing is really important for some of our counterparts in other countries as well, where a lot of this information that's open source, how do we train capacity-wise? How do we inform other key partner countries about what we're seeing in terms of climate modeling or climate impacts, and how they can then take that information themselves and start doing the type of analysis and adaptation planning that we're doing at home? I think the other key piece that Judge Hill mentioned was how we're leading by example at home, how some of our states and regions across the United States are actually using many of these predictive capabilities, or these tools rather, the existing tools, the diagnostic capabilities, and how do we actually partner those with other regions around the world that climatically are actually quite aligned. There's a really interesting sort of analysis out there that a lot of states and cities within the U.S., their counterparts climatically are other places around the world. They have more in likeliness with from New York City to their counterparts versus other states within the United States. So how do we bring those cities and regions together that are in the same sort of climate zones as well? So that's just to pick up on that piece of it.
Great. Chris?
So on integration, that's what's hard about integration is it's as in integrate what, because it's a big playing field. I find that the partners we work with, whether they're the governments we work with, or communities we work with, or donors we work with, in essence, people they get it. They understand that it's important for people to come together. But it's really, what are the great motivators for that to happen? And I think we have found definitely that, survival is a great integrator. That really encourages people to integrate. And some of the programs that we've been doing in Eastern Africa, particularly in Ethiopia, with some of our early stage programs to try to link conflict avoidance and adjustments and adaptation to climate change have been pretty important, and they've been very eye-opening. And they didn't really begin that way in some cases. So one of our most interesting projects occurred back in 2008, 2009, where we were working with local communities to try to set up dispute resolutions approaches, over access to natural resources in a climate-type environment. But it was really focused on the conflict resolution side of the picture. But what we found out in terms of the unintended and beneficial consequences of bringing the people together around problem A is it turned out that once these agreements have been reached over such questions as passage over one group's land by pastoralists over agriculturist lands in order to be able to access water, that the wonderful benefit occurred is that when those systems were in place, is that groups of people that had those understandings established fared far better in adverse climatic situations than those that didn't have those situations, those agreements put in place. Now that would seem obvious, but it really isn't that obvious when you consider the amount of work that has to go into something like that. And now in terms of the building up of the knowledge base, going back to what I was talking about, this great adventure to create this almost new curricula as it relates to climate change, we're studying what's happening and trying to replicate that and build off of it. You know, the other thing I would say about how people feel about integration is that they're intrigued by when you are integrating solutions from unexpected places, in essence. That brings people together in very interesting ways. And it most certainly has brought major donors together, particularly the United States and the Swedes have become huge partners with very, very significant resources. And we've become very tightly integrated in development, in part because we are committed to finding solutions in places that you wouldn't go look to. So we've gone out with huge crowdsourcing efforts and grand challenge sourcing efforts to try to find solutions to these pressing problems and the impact of climate change on reducing food production in water-stressed areas. And I could take you through some great examples of what's come out of that process, but it's an interesting aspect of an integrative approach.
Okay, I'll take a couple of other questions, the harder questions nobody wanted to touch here, I guess.
Yeah, geoengineering.
The gas pedal question, I was hoping somebody was going to pick up on that. And the mitigation still remains a strong part of our national policy. As Judge Hill mentioned, I think we're focusing a little bit more on adaptation because that's an area I think that that needs more focus. I would agree, but that does not reduce the overarching impetus for mitigation and backing off on the gas pedal. Because yeah, if you back off on the RPMs, the red, you get a little bit more room to play with on the red line. So that's absolutely true. The report here, the playbook here, talks about that as well. It says, hey, we're talking a lot about what to do in terms of adaptation, in terms of building resilience, but there is still a mitigation piece. So they certainly did not leave that out. The geoengineering piece, be very, very careful. I know there's a lot of work that's gone into National Academies of Science, National Science Foundation. My personal belief is we do need not just federal policy, we need international agreements on geoengineering. Back in the 1980s, I was a young officer. There were articles being published about we could actually disrupt the structure of tropical cyclones or hurricanes by dropping an atomic bomb into the middle of it. It would reduce the thermodynamic process by which they maintain themselves. Sounds great. Okay, maybe you don't have a hurricane. How about a radioactive tropical storm Isabel coming ashore in Chesapeake? Well, maybe not such a great idea. So people sort of realize that. Any kind of geoengineering like that, we just need to be very, very careful. I think we need to look at it internationally from the perspective, making sure we understand risk and how can, the G7, G20, and large organizations try to bring something together, because it is a pretty big concern that we could do something that could have some very, very dramatic negative effects. Lots of history in terms of bioengineering gone wrong to reduce invasive species when you end up with another invasive species and nobody even thought about. So got to be very, very careful.
Good. Oh.
Sure.
I just wanted to add one point. Thank you, John. On the mitigation side, the President has a climate action plan that really is guiding our way forward, at least in the executive branch, that has 3 pillars. The first is to cut harmful emissions. The second is to prepare for the impacts here in the United States. And the third is to lead internationally, both on resilience internationally as well as cutting emissions internationally. I think a huge effort continues on mitigation, and anyone who works in the resilience space, after you work in it a little while and start thinking about what's being projected and seeing that the impacts are accelerating over the prior projections, concludes that we need to mitigate in order to be, we can't successfully keep planning that we will adapt out of this. So it is at the core of the President's climate action plan that we successfully cut carbon emissions so that we can keep the planet safe. But with that said, we know the impacts are here. We know that in order to continue those efforts, we need to be a resilient nation, and we need to help our allies and others across the world who are suffering and will suffer greatly to be prepared for the impacts, because those impacts will come even if we cut our emissions today.
Melanie, and then
I think that we all had glossed over our mitigation talking points in our remarks because of the nature of this event. And I'd be remiss not to mention also that this G7 report also comes in the context of the G7 Leaders Declaration just recently, where it had a strong focus on climate mitigation and and long-term decarbonization was a key part of the Leaders Declaration. So the foreign ministers focused on one aspect of that, which was the climate security nexus and fragility, where the leaders really focused on the longer-term decarbonization and efforts forward on mitigation as a primary part of their leader statement. And also, I would also be remiss not to mention that we're on the eve of the next strategic and economic dialogue between the U.S. and China that begins tonight and into tomorrow for the next 2 days. And this dialogue is really the premier discussion between U.S. and China on a variety of areas of cooperation, including on climate change. And so we'll spend the next 2 days, the Secretary will be having meetings with his counterparts, really focused on how our 2 countries are the largest emitters out there. What are we doing bilaterally to really reduce emissions? Adaptation is also part of the mix, but really it's a focus on mitigation as well there between the two largest. So thank you.
Terrific. Alex?
I was thinking if we would have the level of humidity in this room that we have outside, it would snow inside. So I wouldn't mind if you reduce a couple of greenhouse gases by just lowering the temperature a little bit. There is room for improvement. Just on mitigation and adaptation, there's a whole chapter in the beginning making clearly the statement, of course, we have to mitigate, reduce greenhouse gases, but the report starts with the assumption that even if we do our best, we entering, no matter, I don't want to go into the 1.5 degrees versus 2 degrees Celsius debate, we will face climate change and dangerous climate change, and particularly those countries that experience any kind of fragility. These are the most vulnerable, so they have to adapt, no matter that the rest of the world, those large emitters, have a global responsibility. That one thing on integration and one on a larger perspective, how this relates to the current debate on SDGs, because that hasn't been mentioned here. I don't know if that is relevant to the debate, so I put this as a question. But the first one, David, you ask about if we have so difficulties facing to integrate, how could we help then countries that have far less capacities at hand in order to deal with this kind of data integration, etc. And the one example that we fleshed out also in the report is we have a very comprehensive tool available, which is climate vulnerability assessment methodologies, where we reach already a point where we have different methodologies in place that can be applied to contexts where you have data available and those where you have absolutely no data. Which is then basically grassroots level participatory generation of knowledge about vulnerability of local communities. In both cases, it's still a question, even if you have, because you're very optimistic on data, if you have data and information available, how you use that. Since you also work on global water issues, or you work on global water issues, and I had the pleasure also working on on the long-term climate impacts on the Nile and Nile riparian states, most of the reports that have been written were not used for political reasons because it's a question of legitimacy of data. So I always ask when I engaged in a COP, and Adelphi is engaged in many projects dealing with climate vulnerability, that from a climate perspective, when we assess vulnerability of a country or a part of a country, we always stop at a level where we ask the question, to what extent does this affect either fragility or even larger political contexts that could lead into conflict. So we still make and agencies make this very strict separation of approaches. If we would do better on that side, I think we could help, no matter how elaborated capacities and technical capacities in these countries are, we could help countries to just develop this integrative approach. It does not mean necessarily that you have to integrate, institutions. On the question of the balance between adaptation and mitigation, one thing that strikes me is to have a better understanding about the global development agenda. I'm not talking about an agenda for developing countries, but the universal development agenda that we are negotiating at this point in September, later in September, to agree on a bunch of 17 goals and 69 targets, sub-targets, which should determine the way we act and develop our policies. And part of the opportunity that I see, even against the background of the complexity of what we came up with so far, something that is difficult in communicating and difficult also in reporting, is that there seemed to be an agreement that the key of putting this into practice is to organize some sort of policy learning and social learning when we start reporting on that. Because countries start now to think about how can we use the existing reporting mechanisms in place for development, for conflict. It's a quite broad agenda. It's the global development agenda that helps us also to better design policies. And I think we missed a little bit in our report to really elaborate in depth on how this relates to the SDG, because it's still to be negotiated and agreed upon in September. But I think that's both a challenge but also an opportunity to address the question of policy integration and also building capacities at particularly domestic level when it comes to reporting and also designing of programs.
Thank you, Alex. So why don't we take a couple more questions. I'm mindful that we also have the opportunity to give David Yang from USAID final remarks, and then before we invite you all to cross the hall for a reception, and the Deputy Chief of Mission, Philip Ackerman from the German Embassy, will have a few remarks there. But we have time for maybe a couple more questions for the panel, and then we'll move to that final section. So we have a question all the way in the back, and then Andrew down here in the front.
Hi, thank you. Elizabeth Grossman, freelance journalist. This discussion is at a very high, broad, strategic level, and I'm wondering if any of you could speak a little bit about how thinking at this high strategic level scale gets integrated with on-the-ground programs, particularly when it involves sort of these kind of predictive data sets, including on water. And I know we're having some of those kind of conversations now in the US around the drought in California and elsewhere, and I'm just wondering if you could speak a little bit about how you take this high-level thinking down to the on-the-ground daily program level.
Terrific. Thank you, Elizabeth. Andrew down here in the front, and then we'll come back to the middle.
Thank you. So, Alexander, you talked about the idea of fragility as opposed to just focusing on fragile states. Looking through the report, though, what I see is a lot of talking about fragile states, about Bangladesh or East Africa or other places. Do you think at all in this report? Did you think at all further about it, and maybe for the broader panel, fragility within developed countries, within the G7, within there are areas of inner cities or
low income areas or other fragile areas. How much are you thinking about that in this report or otherwise? Thanks.
Okay, great. Why don't we get one more halfway up and then just back in the middle. Thanks.
Just following up on the comment about, going from high policy to integration on the ground, how well do you think this is now worked into the fabric of the State Department, for example? I mean, when I was there a long time ago, Warren Christopher was kind of think about environmental issues, and I worked on it for him, and I frankly saw people kind of looking at their watches because they knew he was going to be gone. I mean, I think, it's a serious question about how to keep this moving because interruptions are not helpful to a process like this. Thanks.
Terrific. Thank you, Ruth. Alex, can I ask you to start and say a little bit about the process of some of the country consultations to get at Elizabeth's question about bringing it down to the down level?
So part of this process, we had 12 months time to do the research, the consultation, and the report writing. The report writing took us a while. But part of the exercise were 2 regional consultations that we were run, but not with the purpose of bringing any kind of message to trickle down to the local level. But we went to a couple of doing regional consultations. So when we had one in Nairobi in Kenya, we invited from wider East African countries, government representatives, but also think tanks and NGO reps, in order to discuss the assumptions that we made and basically to check whether our perception of risks or complex risks or compound risks are shared. And some of them have been revised, some of them came up through the consultations, but it's not that, particularly with the part of the kind of recommendations that we make, that we reached already a stage where this is to be communicated in one way or another, because the audience of this report, in the narrow sense, are the G7 foreign offices. And now it's in their hands to think that through and what they are going to do about. And we were discussing internally a lot about whether there are primary audience, there are other audiences. And by reading through the report, you will figure out that we are not addressing just the world of foreign policy, but and diplomats, but across the spectrum of development, climate, environment issues. The other thing is, Andrew, your question on, yes, you are right. There's a certain bias. I wouldn't say that all, there is a group of countries that label themselves fragile states, the G7 plus. There's a group of, depends on what kind of indicator system you use. It's 60 to 80 countries that could be considered as fragile. And of course, we're not looking, as you see from the case studies that we are using, but we have a couple of paragraphs and pages in there where we elaborated of what we call pockets of fragility that, of course, even in stable environments, political environments, and in developing countries or larger transition economies, we have a lot of either situations or pockets of fragility. We didn't play that through down to the level of even go to the city and look at poor income districts and social hotspots, to what extent that could be a trigger for along the spectrum of fragility. But that's true, and we made it clear in the report that this is not about developing countries. It's not about this one group of fragile countries, but it's about fragility that, of course, can happen in also, stable economies or developed economies.
Melanie, could you say a word
Sure.
about the State Department?
Of course. So when I came over to the department, I came over actually with Senator Kerry, then now Secretary Kerry. And it was actually really interesting as I came into my position to figure out, we want to focus on climate change, we want to make it a priority, but how do you actually integrate that into the fabric of the department so it's not just a flash in the pan priority issue for the next 4 years, but something that's actually mainstreamed and integrated. And I actually look to gender as a model for how to do this. As you know, Secretary Clinton elevated gender as a mainstream priority as part of the foreign policy environment within the department. And I looked at the tools that they deployed while she was secretary to really make that stick, because now under Secretary Kerry, gender continues to be a top priority within the department. It's mainstreamed and integrated fully into a lot of our programming and policy planning. And so looking at the success in what happened with gender integration as a foreign policy priority, taking some of those tools, we're now looking at that as a climate priority context. And those things, frankly, they're quite benign, because in the department, as you know, it's a large bureaucracy, and the ways you're actually going to mainstream that is to really get it into kind of the really kind of staff level understanding perspective. And as part of that, as I mentioned in the QDDR, we are now starting to train up more staff, and more Foreign Service officers are going out into the field with more climate training and climate awareness. Part of that will actually be part of this would be resiliency and adaptation issues in addition to mitigation. We're also getting the range of, from public affairs to economic officers to even the population, refugees, and migrations team, a broader footprint within the department to be understanding of how climate affects what they do, whether it's democracy, human rights, and labor, whether it's political military affairs. So all these people are also getting trained up in terms of how climate is part of what they do. And the other key piece of this, or two key pieces rather, would be on, as I mentioned, country and regional programming. Every couple of years, different countries and regions put together what their programming is going to look like, or their priority areas. And we're now working to work in climate change, adaptation, resilience as part of the screening that Judge Hill mentioned, but also as part of how climate is going to affect them and how you bring that into their country planning. And that's actually going to go out well beyond our time, my time at state in particular, as well as the chairman's time, or the secretary's time. The other key piece to mention is the screening aspect. And once we start to overlay screening of resilience into our programming, that's another key area to call attention at the ambassador level. What are we doing that's screening for climate? How is climate actually affecting some of our on-the-ground programming and projects? As you know, I'll turn to Chris on this. AID is a lot of our boots on the ground when it comes to real kind of nitty-gritty programming, and we more on the policy side from the department's perspective. So I'll let Chris answer that part of it. But really, these are some aspects where I'm confident that when we walk out of the building, these are aspects of climate that'll still be part of the fabric of what we're doing.
Chris will now answer that. So I think that at AID we welcome this great attention on resilience, because we see it as a solution, and that's what's really critical, because these problems are so enormously complicated and difficult to resolve. So the second part of it is, with resilience as a solution, is to capture again the knowledge on where we're having successful projects that relate to resilience. But where the shift is that because climate change affects millions of people, our thinking has to shift to solutions that can affect millions of people, not 10,000 here or 100 here or 500 there. While that's important, and we have projects to do that. And I think one of the projects we have at AID that is reflective of this commitment to resilience is a project called the Productive Safety Net Program in Ethiopia, which is definitely worth taking a hard look at. To make it last, you really have to affect the programming over a long period of time, and you do that by making a commitment to integrating climate change into your development programs, and that's what we're in the process of doing as we go across the agency point by point. But I think the other way you do it, and also gets the question of making things last, is through the hiring and kind of who are you bringing into the organization over time, and what kinds of people are being hired. So we are in a process of rebuilding our technical capacity really significantly in the organization. And I must say that, for example, in AID's commitment to rebuild its engineering base, the wonderful added value to that, beyond the technical expertise that an engineer brings in a specific discipline, is a systems-based approach to problem solving. And that becomes very, very key as we move ahead. I did want to answer the question that was posed about how do you go from way up here to way down here. So way up here implies that we're kind of distant, but we're getting a lot of data around the world, but we're kind of way up there in our discussion. Way down here, deals with what's really happening to people that are suffering terribly, on the ground. And, aid is in 80 countries around the world. And what's wonderful about people at AID is that not only are they sharp, they're intrepid. They really get out into the field to see what's going on. And they are an enormously kind of brave, informed workforce. And I was away from aid for some 20 years and was asked to come back about 5 years ago. I'd been in the Foreign Service. And that one of the things I admire about aid is it adapts. And I think one of the most important adaptations it's made is its commitment to hiring and putting into positions of significant responsibility women. When I was at AID, there were very few women that were in senior executive positions. Now, they're in positions across the agency, and we don't really think of people in the case of whether it's a woman or a man going out in the field. We think of in the case of a first-rate professional, and it's really improved the way in which we deal and relate to conditions on the field. So it's a shifting organization that is able to be far more sensitive to what's happening on the ground. And that's a very, very important dynamic of what we do.
Well, terrific, Chris. It's appropriate then to ask one of your colleagues from AID to help us close the session. David Yang, please invite you up to the stage. David is a Deputy Assistant Administrator in AID's Bureau for Democracy, Conflict, and Humanitarian Assistance. He's also Founding Director of AID's Center for Excellence on Democracy, Human Rights, and Governance. We give him the last word, and then, as I said, we'll adjourn across the hall for reception.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Good afternoon, everybody. I was supposed to speak at the beginning as part of the welcoming committee, but now I'm at the end, so I feel doubly awkward. Chris expressed a certain amount of awkwardness being the wrap-up person of the substantive part, and now I'm the wrap-up of the wrap-up, so I feel doubly awkward, and I'll explain why. I was here to really just provide some grace notes, which I will provide, but now that I come at the end, I'm tempted to wade out of my comfort zone, which is democratic governance, human rights, and peace building, and wade into the area of climate change, which I know very little about. And so excuse me if I embarrass myself among an audience of experts, but I want to share some thoughts. First, the grace notes. I had the honor about 20 years ago when I was much younger to serve for about better part of a year as Warren Christopher's one of the members of his last speech writing team, and he really taught me how to write grace notes. So that's what I was really supposed to do at the top of the meeting, but I came from a separate engagement, which is important to this discussion today. So the first grace note I want to develop is to deliver is to thank Cynthia Brady and Jeffrey Delbecco for really many years' effort now in, at least from AID's development perspective, linking climate change and conflict fragility. It's been really pioneering work, and we're very grateful within AID overall, but particularly in the bureau that houses the Conflict Management Mitigation Office, the Bureau for Democracy, Conflict, and Humanitarian Assistance. We're grateful for this partnership. We're so grateful that we saw the opportunity of further support to support Jeffrey as one of the authors, along with Alex and others, on the report. So that's my first grace note. My second grace note, and let me wade into the substantive territory, is to really endorse the report. It's a terrific report. Congratulations to Alec, Jeffrey, and all the other authors. For me, reading it quickly, the arithmetic of it is compelling, and I don't know if these numbers jumped out at you as you poured through the many pages, but in a quick reading, the 7 compound risks, the 3 policy sectors that need greater coordination, the 4 bundled recommendations about how to integrate starting at home and beyond in the multilateral community, and finally the 5 substantive action areas that the report leaves us with. I think that arithmetic is very, very compelling to all of us. Compelling because I think collectively it answers really the planet's challenge. I was speaking of the Sustainable Development Goals. We in the U.S. government were adding comments to the draft political declaration that will be issued in September at the Great Summit, releasing the new Millennium Development Goals, the Sustainable Development Goals of 2015 to 2030. And I wrote in the margin of my comments electronically as I saw the draft, because there was one beautiful, from a former speechwriter's perspective, a beautiful sentence that said in a very Cassandra-like way we may be the first generation, we the leaders of the world, in September 2015 at the United Nations, we may be the first generation to have the opportunity to banish extreme poverty once and for all. And then it went on to say we may be the last generation to have a chance to address the existential threats posed to our planetary society. And I wrote in the margins, I said, that's a great rhetorical line. But I wonder, I asked, substantively, unless we make climate change, and I'm not a climate change expert, but I said if you're going to aver that thought, perhaps we should, among the SDGs, it's just a thought, make climate change primus inter pares of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, because that phrase leaped out at me, if we are indeed the last generation, which many people obviously think. So let me just bundle together some thoughts. I think the key substantive thing that I want to impart is that AID, as your development agency, as America's development agency, is beginning to grapple with the notion of integration of these three policy sectors. That is climate adaptation and mitigation efforts first, development assistance including humanitarian assistance second, peace building assistance third. And AID really is at the intersection of those three movements or tools or policy sectors as said in the report. I came late today and got in this awkward situation now because I was at our annual conference of democratic governance and human rights officers. We're 400 strong in USAID, and we have a 3-day annual conference that opened today. I was hosting Ambassador Power by video conference and came late. But my point is, we were grappling in that sector as opposed to the peace-building sector, as opposed to the climate sector, with the notion of how do we integrate democratic governance and human rights into all of the social and economic sectors, including climate change, into AID's overall development portfolio. Because we believe on principle that human rights and democratic governance and those principles and approaches will help to contribute to the sustainability of all our poverty reduction and climate change efforts. And so we're grappling in our sector of democratic governance and human rights with how to do that. By the same token, because Goal 16 brings together governance issues, inclusive society issues, and peace-building issues, that is Goal 16 of the Sustainable Development Goals, because it brings us together, we in AID have pioneered, and we're quite happy with that fusion of goals within Goal 16. We've pioneered within the form and embodied in the form of the Democracy, Conflict, and Humanitarian Assistance Bureau, bridging conflict resolution, peace building, and democracy building and human rights protection. And now the frontier for us is to bring it to the other sectors like climate change, like food security, and other, like health, and other important social sectors. We don't think this is something on the horizon. We think it's practical right now, this integration and this fusion of national security and climate change. Somebody asked, how does this affect our programmings? How does all this strategy stuff affect our programmings? Well, experts like Cynthia can tell you that the way we approached our assistance to both earthquake in Nepal, the way we approached our assistance to Ebola-affected Liberia, or the way that we provide food aid in the continuing horrible situation in South Sudan, or how we approach democratic governance in Kenya, or how we approach conflict resolution in Jordan. In all those ways, programmatically, AID is grappling with the link between climate change and how that impacts and exacerbates conflict and fragility. So let me add some final forward-looking thought, and that is 2015 is a key year. 2015 is a key year to integrate these three policy sectors. 2015 is a key year to begin this dialogue of doing integration at home and then taking it on the road. What I mean is, of course, the big summit on the Sustainable Development Goals in New York in September. What I mean is the Financing for Development Conference, which will take place next month in Addis. What I mean is that the New Deal for Engagement in Fragile States, its mandate is up for renewal this year. What I mean is that the UN will also review in this really heavy schedule at the General Assembly in the fall, also review and culminate its review of peace operations and review the future peace-building architecture. What I mean is that 1325, the important 15-year resolution now on women, peace, and security, will also be reviewed at this year's General Assembly. And finally, what I mean, of course, is the Climate Change Summit in December. In all these multilateral forums, we can take all the great work that's been described by Melanie, Admiral White, Judge Hill, and Chris, and begin taking this experimentation within the U.S. government and take it on the road into all these forums so that 2015 can be truly the start of the year where we really addressed this challenge of being perhaps the last generation to address climate change, not only for our national security, but our planetary security. So thanks for coming today, and really thanks to the Wilson Center for convening and for contributing to this excellent report.
Thank you. Thank you very much, David. We appreciate your comments, all our panelists and speakers today. For those of you who are here, please pick up the hard copies. For those of you watching online and want to share this, all this stuff can be found and lots more online. So we urge you to find that on newclimateforpeace.org and, of course, the Wilson Center and Adelphi sites as well. As I said, please join us just across the hall for reception. And as I said, we'll have the DCM from the German Embassy sharing a few thoughts with us there as well, Philip Ackerman. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks so much. For real.
To meet you.
Thank you. Melanie?
Yes, good to see you again.
Good. Yeah.
I knew that it was all before.
I know. It's a very